Let's move on to talking about some music now. It's interesting as we look into ancient music. It's a different study than what you would do with archaeology or history, because with music it's harder to know what things really were like in ancient times. It's almost impossible to know, really. But what we do is we can use our bodies as musicians to better understand how things would have been played, how instruments would have been played. Because no matter what, in ancient times they would have either had to play music with their hands or sing it with their mouths, and they would have heard it through their ears. So we have this physiological functionality that we can use in understanding ancient times. And in doing that, it's important to know that there's many oral traditions that have been passed down for hundreds of years that give us a picture of what music could have been like as well. And we'll talk about some of those connections later, but there's some really distinct connections between ancient instruments and modern instruments that sort of highlight important characteristics that are similar in them. And so I wanted to play you this quick video clip. Renee mentioned that during the time that I spent with the Silk Road Project, they had replicated this ancient Central Asian harp from a museum piece it's just a fragment that's over 2,000 years old, but it's of an ancient harp. And so they replicated it in a way that would be consistent with the time period of which it was built. And then they kind of just brought it out for us to try and play it like on the spot. So it was kind of a great thing to just sort of experiment with. But this little clip just kind of highlights that idea of using a knowledge of a tradition and then using your body and your knowledge of technique can help you understand or give you a picture at least of what ancient music could have been like. And we're going to use this concept with our wonderful trumpeter Chris Grady later on. He's going to demonstrate on the trumpet a similar concept of this idea. And I haven't said this yet, but there's a silver trumpet in the Tutankhamun exhibit, and that's why we're going to be doing that with Chris later. So let me play this for you real quick. And at the time I was studying some of the Central Asian lute techniques of the komus and other instruments. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And that's the technique that I sort of used to try in my little version of experimenting with this ancient harp, or the replica of the ancient harp.
復元した古代のハープは真白場さんが劉さんから借り受けタングルウッドに持ち帰られていました。ヨーヨーマさんも興味津々です。
This is it. Yes.
Okay. So this is all right.
Okay. This is the replica of the harp, and would be hard.
How does the Kazakh melody go? We'll try playing it.
Sure. I did make an attempt, but yeah, would be hard. That's great, you're doing great.
I'm sorry, I think the rhythm's wrong too.
For the half step, you know.
ヨーヨーマさんの関心はさらに音色へと向かいます。
See, that sounds like the koto. See, the trick now is to get Matt to make this instrument to sound like a double bass. If you can do that.
Oh man, he's so right too. It's so bad.
Come with sound. That's very good.
I'm a really bad singer. Yeah.
Someone sing.
But Chris is going to be using that same sort of idea with the trumpet and using his knowledge of technique on an instrument and then applying it to the historical framework that we know about ancient Egypt and about the ancient trumpet and from what we have and seeing it in the Tut exhibit. So we'll go into that all later. So let's talk about the musical instruments from the earliest ones that date back. And let me close this down here. The earliest musical instruments that have ever been found were found in an archaeological dig that is just as significant as the finding of King Tut's tomb, and it was found in it's found in modern day Iraq, but it was from the Mesopotamian culture, and it was the name of the area, or the find was called the Royal Cemetery at Ur. And in it, now this is interesting, in it there was jewelry made of lapis lazuli, as well as a handheld harp in the shape of a bull made of lapis lazuli and gold. And this archaeological dig dates back to 2700 BC. So that's the earliest find. Within that find, they found musical instruments as well. So from 2700 BC, that's showing proof of trade in lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq, over 1,000 years before King Tut's reign. So it shows that that link in trade goes back, over 1,000 years before King Tut. So let's talk about so the musical scenes were depicted on Mesopotamian plaques and seals, as well as there's names of instruments in some of their written texts, and there's also a really strong connection between Mesopotamian and Egyptian culture in musical instruments as well, because in various archaeological digs they found the same instruments in Mesopotamian digs that they found in Egyptian digs. So that means that there was a cross-pollination of trade among those two cultures that goes back at least to 3000 BC. So we're going to, like we do in talking about ancient history, we're going to jump 1,500 years to 1500 BC, which is about 150 years before King Tut's reign. And that's when a Central Asian empire, known as the Kassite Empire, conquered Mesopotamia. And at that point, we see a much greater Central Asian influence on Egyptian culture in their instruments. And some of the instruments that begin to appear that were of Central Asian descent were harps, lyres, lutes, and trumpets. A lyre is a small handheld harp, and a lute is a small guitar-like instrument with a small body and a long neck. And so as different empires traded off their domination of this Central Asian region after 1500 BC, the instruments that were developed along the ancient Silk Road began to lose their national characteristics. So an instrument would migrate from one area to another and then would begin developing on its own within whatever culture it was in. And we see this today too, especially like the spike fiddle or Comanche is a good example of that, where it's found in Persian music, it's found in Azerbaijani music. The ney, which Steve has tonight, and he'll show you an example of that, is a wooden flute that's found in many different traditions across Central Asia and the Middle East. So that was happening even way back when, as different empires would conquer themselves in various ways.